This is page 333. And we're at the top of the page on the Your Turn. The directions read, graph and label each point on the coordinate plane. So P is at -4, 2. -4 means 4 to the left and up 2. So put a point here and put a P. And Q is at 3, 2.5. 3 is to the right and 2.5 is up 2.5. 2.5 would be exactly in between 2 and 3. So that's where Q goes. And R is at -4.5, that's -4.5, and then down 5. It's going to be right here. That's a really poor point. That is R. And we've got 4, -5. 4 is to the right and -5 is down. It's right here. That's S. And T is at -2.5, that's to the left 2.5 and up 0. So it's actually on the x-axis. T. Okay, make sure your points are exactly where mine are. If you don't understand one of those, please ask me for help. All right, let's move on. Reading scales on axes. The scale of an axis is the number of units that each grid line represents. So far, the graphs in this lesson have had a scale of 1 unit, but graphs frequently use other units. Example 3. The graph shows the location of a city. It also shows the location of Gary's and Jen's house. The scales on each axis represent miles. Use the scale to describe Gary's location relative to the city. Each grid square is 5 miles on a side. Let's say you didn't know that. Let's say you didn't know it was 5 miles each. You could figure it out, and here's why. If you look carefully, from here to there is 2 spaces, but it's 10 miles. What has to be right here? It's got to be 5. So this one would be 15, this would be 25. You can just see the pattern there. So what that means is that every space on here would represent 5 miles. You can see that even if the directions weren't printed clearly on the if it wasn't printed right here, you would still know. It's right here. You would still know by looking at the axis. So we're going to go to Gary's house. Gary's house is at -25, -15. And we know that because if you go from the city here, how do you get to Gary's? Well, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to the left, and 5 times 5 is 25. So this is -25 because it's to the left, and it's up 1, 2, 3 spaces. 3 times 5 is 15. So I want to review really quickly how we got those numbers. Well, if this were a scale of 1, Gary's numbers would be -5, 3. But since the scale is actually 5, we multiply these numbers by 5. And 5 times -5 is -25. It's right here. And 3 times 5 is 15. All right, let's move on. B says describe the location of Jen's house relative to Gary's house. So Jen's house is right here. We're comparing Jen's house to Gary's house, not Jen's house to the city. So if we think about Gary's house, we have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 6 spaces to the right, but 6 times 5 is 30. And I guess that's all we need to do right here. Jen's house is located 6 grid squares to the right of Gary's house. Since each grid square is 5 miles on a side, her house is 30 miles away from Gary's. I guess that's all we had to do. All right, let's move on. Let's try the Your Turn. Number 11, it reads, use the graph in the example. Ted lives 20 miles south and 20 miles west of the city represented on the graph in example 3. His brother Ned lives 50 miles north of Ted's house. Give the coordinates of each brother's house. So here's what we're going to do. We have to know a couple things. I need to make this kind of small for a minute just so we can see everything. We have to know a couple things here. We have to know what south and west are, and luckily we have a compass rose right here. South would be down and west would be to the left. I'm going to cover up Gary and Jen because I just want it to be kind of simple here. And I'm going to put Ted and his brother Ned. Ted and Ned, that's interesting. Okay, so what do we know about Ted? Ted lives 20 miles south and 20 miles west of the city. So 20 miles south would be, I'm going to do west first because I'm comfortable with that. So I'm going to go 5, 10, 15, 20 miles west, and 5, 10, 15, 20 miles south. It says give the coordinates of each brother's house. The coordinates of Ted's house will be negative 20, comma negative 20. Now if you're wondering why they're both negative, because negative would be to the left and down would be negative also. The west and the south both mean negative. So it's negative 20, comma negative 20. That's for Ted. Now what about Ned? Where does Ned live? Ned lives 50 miles north of Ted's house, and it doesn't say anything about going east or west. It just says north. So how do I get 50 miles north? Well, I got to go 10 spaces. I can count 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. Ned lives right there. Now what space is that? That's negative 20. And it is positive. So I'm going to go 10, 20, 30. It's positive 30. And those are correct. So that's where Ned lives, and that's where Ted lives. Those are a little bit tricky, but they're not too bad. Okay, sorry that's a little bit messy, but it's hard to write with this stylus, and it's hard to write on a small area. Okay, good job. You are done with page 333.